Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Case for Life program. What would cause a prominent pro-life advocate and politician to change his mind on abortion and switch almost on a dime from being pro-life to pro-abortion? We'll take a look at that in this episode of the Case for Life. Before we dive into that, I want to remind you that one of our primary sponsors, Summit Ministries, currently has open spaces for its summer conferences that your student should be at. Now, let me tell you about Summit. I teach there. I've taught there now for 20 years, and Summit is a 2-week program that equips your students to defend a biblical worldview in preparation for the kind of stuff they're going to get confronted with when they leave the safety of your home and head off to college or the workplace. And I cannot think of a finer program that equips students to defend a biblical worldview than Summit. I have seen hundreds of students I know personally go through that program and become more grounded in their faith because of it. I certainly hope you'll take a look at our sites and see the links there to connect with Summit Ministries. All right. Well, this week, a number of things happened that were interesting. Let me start with the first, and that is the death of former Democrat candidate Reverend Jesse Jackson. Now, many of you hear the name Jesse Jackson, and right away what you think about is someone who is a black activist, who promotes wokeness, who was very much in favor of liberal causes. And you're not wrong about that, but there's something you don't know perhaps, and that is this. Jesse Jackson in the 1970s was one of the most articulate defenders of the pro-life view I've ever seen. But something shifted, and we'll get to what that was in a minute. But before then, I want to read you some of what he said in the 1970s when he was very articulately defending the pro-life view. Okay, this is from a magazine article in Jet, which is an African-American journal, and he wrote in 1973 the following, quote, "Abortion is genocide. If people use preventative measures to stop the life process from originating, I can buy that." In other words, he's okay with contraception, but he goes on. "But if they get carried enough away to set the baby in process," meaning if the baby's been conceived, "they must get carried enough away to accept the responsibility of the baby." And I don't want to hear this bit about babies not really living until the baby has a face and the doctor smacks it and it cries. Anything growing is living, or as we like to say at LTI, dead things don't grow. He's spot on about that. He goes on. He says, if you got the thrill to set the baby in motion and you don't have the will to protect it, you're dishonest. But you don't try to stop reproducing and procreating human life at its best, for who knows if the cure for cancer won't come from some mind, some black child. Okay, he goes on, though, and says this in 1977 in a National Right to Life article. He says, in the abortion debate, the crucial question is, when does life begin? In other words, he's agreeing with what we teach, that you got to answer the question, what is the unborn, before you answer the question, can we kill the unborn? He says, anything growing is living. Again, we agree. Therefore, human life begins when the sperm and egg join and drop into the fallopian tube, and the pulsation of life takes place. From that point, life may be described differently. Some may say it's an egg, a fertilized egg, an embryo, a fetus, baby, child, teenager, adult, but the essence is the same through all of those stages. Okay, he goes on. The name has changed, but the game remains the same. Human beings cannot give or create life by themselves. It is a gift from God. Therefore, one does not have the right to take away through abortion that which he does not have the ability to give. Okay, that's pretty solid stuff. Solid scientifically, solid philosophically, in that he argues that once you have a living being, it remains the same kind of thing through all stages, and solid theologically. God is the author of life. We don't have the authority to take what he gives of his own sovereign will. He goes on to say this: some argue, suppose the woman does not want to have a baby. They say the very fact that she does not want the baby means that the psychological damage to the child is reason enough to abort the baby. I disagree. The solution to that problem is not to kill the innocent baby, but to deal with her values, meaning the mother's values, and her attitude toward life. And we should work with her on the reasons why she doesn't want the child. Killing the baby isn't an option. Deal with the attitude that would allow her to take away that which she cannot give. Again, really solid stuff here. He finishes up by saying some women argue that the man does not have the baby and will not be responsible for the baby after it's born. Therefore, it's okay to kill the baby. Again, he says the logic is off. The premise is that the man is irresponsible. If that is the problem, then deal with making him responsible. Deal with what you are dealing with. Don't kill the weak, the innocent, and the unprotected. He says this: the essence of Jesus' message dealt with this very problem. Jesus said, if in your heart, and he was speaking there as his central message, the actual abortion issue is a mere logical conclusion of a prior heart attitude. And that attitude is a callous one toward life itself. Okay, I love this. He's getting right to the core of the issue. The abortion debate is not about wantedness or unwantedness. I mean, the homeless are unwanted. Can we kill them? Of course not. It's not about whether it's going to be a hardship on the mother. Hardship does not justify homicide. If we're dealing with a human life, the fact that that human life presents challenges to us is not reason enough to intentionally kill that innocent human life. He's spot on here. And it raises the question, what happened with Jesse Jackson that he would change from being outspokenly pro-life in the 1970s to in the 1980s shifting 180 degrees the other way? And I'll tell you what the answer is, and what the answer is in full versus what it is only in part. What it is in part is that Reverend Jackson wanted to be the Democrat nominee for president. And he began running for president the first time in 1983, 84. And in that time, he flip-flopped on abortion because he recognized that you cannot go to the top of the Democrat Party in today's world and be pro-life. I mean, this is exactly what Governor Bob Casey of Pennsylvania at the time recognized. You may remember he was the lone Democrat in the 1992 convention where Bill Clinton was the nominee who was pro-life. And he was scheduled to speak in a primetime slot at that convention, but he got canceled. And he got canceled for one reason only. He was pro-life and not pro-abortion. So they just scrubbed him. That's the Democrat Party today. You cannot be against abortion and remain in the Democrat Party. They don't make any room for you. It is unquestioned obedience to the God of sacrificing children. If you don't worship at that altar in the Democrat Party, they're going to scrub you like they did Bob Casey. And Jesse Jackson knew that he had no hope of going to the top of the Democrat machine if he did not change his position on abortion. So he did. But there was something else that happened at a deeper worldview level. And this is something I've talked to you about before. It's real easy for us, I think, at times to just sit there and go, well, so-and-so did this because they had political motives, or so-and-so did this because they would profit from it. And that's as far as we go. Now, it may be true that they do profit from changing their mind, or it may be true that they have political aspirations that are helped by flip-flopping on abortion. But I think we need to take a little bit deeper look. What happened in the worldview of Jesse Jackson that changed his mind? And I think we get a clue reading something he wrote in 1988. He says, quote, "It is not right to impose private, religious, and moral positions on public policy." Now think about the shift there from what he said in the 70s to what he's now saying here. Now, first of all, when someone says it's not right to impose private, religious, moral positions on public policy, they are not being neutral. They are espousing a worldview known as relativism, the belief that right and wrong have no objective referent. Rather, right and wrong are strictly a function of what we construct individually or what our society constructs, but there are no objective principles above us that we're supposed to align with. That's relativism. And you hear it in language like this: oh, we shouldn't impose our morals on anyone. Well, of course, as soon as you say that, what are you doing? You're imposing a moral rule. You're saying basically there are no moral rules that are objective, but wait a minute, here's one you've got to obey. Don't you dare impose your private morality on somebody else. But notice what else Jackson does here. He reduces all moral questions to matters of mere preference, private subjective belief. And this is rooted in a deeply held cultural conviction of our day that religious truth does not count as real knowledge. Now, suppose it were true that the pro-life view could not be defended anyway but by using religion. Now, I don't believe that, and we have given you many times on this show a clear defense of the pro-life view that is accessible to anyone, believer or not. We'll review that perhaps before this show is over. But notice the assumption here. Religious truth claims don't count as real knowledge. Well, think about the implications of that. That means our own Declaration of Independence is invalidated. Why? Because think about what the founders grounded our rights in. They grounded our rights not in the positive law that a legislature might construct, not in a judicial law that judges make up, but rather they argued that our most fundamental rights, what we would call natural rights that we have in virtue of being human, that those natural or fundamental rights come directly from God. They are grounded in the character of God, and it is God who grants them to human beings in virtue of them being image bearers. It is not something government invents. Well, if Jackson is right that it's wrong to impose anything religious, there goes the Declaration of Independence. And oh, by the way, there also goes Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. Because if you read that letter, which by the way is very powerful, and I am well aware, by the way, that Martin Luther King had very troubling moral characteristics. He did a lot of bad stuff, okay? I'm aware of that. He cheated on his wife. There's pretty good evidence that he sexually abused younger women for his own pleasure. All that's out there. I'm aware of that. But if we just look at the ideas he communicated, how did Martin Luther King convey his case for equal justice under the law for all races, black, white, whatever? Well, he grounded that in the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, he wasn't the only civil rights leader who did that. Mamie Till, the mother of Emmett Till, the African-American boy you'll remember who was killed at age 14 in the South by racists. Well, when she spoke of the injustice of his death, she did not say the American system has got to be burnt to the ground. It is inherently racist, the way we hear the woke crowd talk about it today. Rather, she argued that we as Americans need to do a better job living up to our fundamental principles. What fundamental principles? How about this one? That we are all equal because our value, dignity, and equality is grounded in our status as image bearers, and our rights come from our Creator. Government doesn't invent them. So this idea that religion can't have anything to say about public policy, would absolutely undermine the entire American founding and would undermine the foundation of our most fundamental rights. So Jackson here is really out on a limb, but I think the most troubling thing here is, again, he has embraced a worldview that moral claims are no different than likes and dislikes. You like chocolate ice cream, I like vanilla. Let's not judge one another because nobody can claim to be right. These are private, subjective beliefs. But morality isn't like that. If I make the claim chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla, and therefore you should like chocolate over vanilla, you might say, all right, that makes sense on a preference level. But if I say to you, chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla, and you are morally obligated to eat it, well, then you would rightly say, wait a minute, you're making a matter of preference a matter of morality, and that's a category error, and you would be right. If somebody says, hey, it's wrong to torture toddlers for fun, they are not talking about what they like or prefer. They're talking about what's right or wrong regardless of one's preferences. And here Jackson is giving just a textbook example of confusing moral claims about what's right and wrong objectively with a preference claim about ice cream, what you like or dislike. And another thing I might add here is Jackson himself goes on to make very strong moral claims. Now, they're moral claims that I believe are mistaken, but he will argue that denying a woman a right to choose abortion is a fundamental injustice. Well, wait a minute. If all morality is private, religious, and subjective, who is he to impose that view on pro-lifers who disagree with him? That's the problem he runs into. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to deal with another issue that came up this week, dealing with Rebecca Todd Peters, an alleged Presbyterian minister, and we'll talk about what she had to say about abortion and why it does not hold water. We'll see you on the other side of this break. Hello, friends. You may not have time to read a full-length treatment of abortion like I've done in this book, The Case for Life, the second edition, but you may have time to take what amounts to 7 sessions, a week's worth of study if you want to do it day by day, to learn how to defend your pro-life views persuasively. We have a basic course that will help you do just that. You will learn how to make a formal case for the pro-life position. You will learn how to defend it with science and philosophy. Even with non-Christians, you can make a case for the pro-life view. Then we'll teach you how to handle objections, how to recognize the 5 bad ways people argue about abortion, and how they often bring up things that are beside the point. You'll learn to keep the main thing, so that you're in charge instead of feeling like you're in the hot seat whenever the issue of abortion comes up. Visit the website for details. Welcome back, friends. As I said before the break, there was another news item this last week involving Rebecca Todd Peters. Rebecca Todd Peters is a Presbyterian USA ordained minister. Now, we're not going to debate whether women can be pastors on this show. I happen to believe they shouldn't be, but I want to just deal with what she says about abortion. And she did a social media post that said the following: abortion is a moral good. Abortion is an act of love. Abortion is an act of grace. And finally, abortion is a blessing. Now, I went ahead and reposted that on my social media pages and asked for people to comment. I was curious to see how Christians would respond to that. And I have to be honest with you, I was disappointed, not because their answers weren't biblically correct, they were, but because they didn't show any ability to interact with somebody who says what she just said on her social media pages. Here was the most common response: well, the fires of hell are going to be pretty hot for someone that thinks like she does. Judgment Day is coming. I wonder how she's going to stand up there. She is a wolf. She is not a minister of God. She is a deceiver of the brethren. Okay, I agree with all of those statements, but suppose you were engaging someone who thinks as she does, would those responses be persuasive? And I'm here to tell you they would not be. Here's the thing that you want to start with. If I were debating Rebecca Todd Peters, and by the way, I would love to, and if an opportunity arises, I will do it. In fact, I will debate her in front of her own class at her university where she teaches. Just invite me, I'll come in. I'm a nice guy, Reverend Peters. I won't attack you personally, but I will debate you on the merits of your argument, and I would love to do it. I'll jump at it. Here's what I would say if that were the essence of her opening statement. I would say, Reverend Peters, you say abortion is an act of love. For whom? You say abortion is an act of grace. For whom? You say abortion is a blessing. For whom? Is it a blessing for the unborn that gets systematically poisoned or dismembered in the womb? I mean, clearly not. Notice the flaw, the fundamental flaw that almost everybody in the comment section on my thread missed. She is assuming the unborn are not human. I think in my response, I would frame my response exactly like this. Reverend Peters, I agree with everything you just said. Pro-lifers should butt out of this debate. We should not impose our views on others. I agree with you, abortion is an act of love. I agree with you, it's an act of grace. And I agree it's a blessing for women. I agree completely, 100% with you. If what? If the unborn are not human. But you're going to need to argue they're not human, not merely assume they're not human. In other words, her entire post here is question begging. She assumes the unborn aren't human. And by question begging, here's what I mean. It doesn't mean that raises a question. It means she is assuming the very thing she's trying to prove. The essence of the debate over abortion is around the status of the unborn. She assumes an answer to it, namely that they're not human, without ever arguing for it. Look at arguments for choice, trusting women to make their own decisions, not invading one's personal privacy, would never work as arguments for killing a toddler or a teenager or an adult. They only work with fetuses when critics of the pro-life view assume the unborn are not human. But she has to argue for that, not merely assume it. And if I ever get the chance to debate her, I will nail her to the wall on that question. I'm going to make her answer the question, what is the unborn? You cannot argue that we can kill the unborn until you argue the question, what is the unborn? And I'm not going to let her get away with assuming anything, and you shouldn't let others get away with it either. But I was kind of surprised that of the 54 to 60 comments I got on my thread, nobody picked that up. Men and women, this is not a good thing for the pro-life view when we miss the fundamental thing we need to engage with. What we tend to do is we just take whatever the person's saying and we accept the premise of their claim and then start arguing against that premise. No, you should challenge the legitimacy of the premise in the first place. If someone's going to argue, oh, you're just against choice, you hate women. Well, maybe I do, maybe I don't. How does that disprove my argument that the unborn are human and should not be intentionally killed? In other words, challenge the premise of their argument. Don't just accept it and then start trying to answer the person on their terms. She needs to argue the unborn are not human. Is it an act of love to dismember an unborn human being in the womb? Is it an act of love or grace to do that to another human being? That's the question, not all this talk about choice or trusting women or abortion being a blessing. This is nonsense once you frame it explicitly as a justification for intentionally killing another innocent human being. And I think we miss the core issue so often. We want so badly to refute the person that we don't challenge the premises they're bringing to the debate. Now, notice again that Reverend Peters like Jesse Jackson, who we talked about in the first segment of this show, is assuming moral relativism. She would never argue it's okay to kill transgender people because it's a moral good, because it's an act of love, because it's an act of grace. She would never say that. Not only would she not say that because she knows they're human beings, she also would say we can't do that because it would be morally wrong. The reason she posits abortion as being a preference issue over a moral issue has to do with her wanting to feel validated in her position. Now, I did a little background research on her. And by the way, I'm hoping that next week or soon on this show, I will have an interview with Megan Allman, who many of you may go, wait a minute, that name sounds familiar. Yeah, she was an LTI speaker for 15 years. So she was a vital part of our team. And while she was a vital part of our team, she did a lot of research into Rebecca Todd Peters. And I'm going to bring her on to talk about her in more detail, because more and more as we approach the 2028 elections, I'm here to tell you something. You are going to hear a full-on challenge against Christians on the issue of abortion. And the argument is going to be that the Bible and historic Christianity supports the practice. You need to know how to respond to that. We have a Senate candidate running in the state of Texas that is running almost exclusively on an alleged biblical case for the permissibility of abortion. Think about that. A Senate candidate in Texas, a red state, who's building his campaign, which, by the way, is gaining traction almost solely on the idea that the Bible and historic Christianity supports abortion. Well, Rebecca Todd Peters believes the same exact thing. So we're going to have Megan on, and we're going to unpack more of what people like Rebecca Todd Peters think. But for today, here's what I want you to understand. When somebody tries to argue for abortion, but they don't take morals seriously, they think they're mere preferences, their whole case is undermined. Now, in looking into her background, I noted that she had 2 abortions, and here's what she said about them. They were a blessing, she writes, and she says, I felt perfectly good about it, and she basically is arguing that God smiled on her. She felt a peace about having these abortions. Now, right away, warning flags should be going off in your head. How does having a peace about something mean that it's right? How many couples have I talked to or heard of who had adulterous affairs because they felt a peace about getting involved with a person who's not their spouse? Or they felt a peace about getting involved in a shady business deal because, after all, it would help their families. That is a bad way for Christians to think, and yet many Christians do that when they expect subjective personal revelation from God. Again, I look forward to talking with Megan Allman about this, and we'll do that the next time we meet.